Now, I want to talk to you next on what I consider to be the road to Igbo Renaissance. The way in which the Yorubas walk their way to political reckoning is not unveiled, as I will show in the later part of my presentation. But it suffices to say that it holds significant lessons for Igbo elite, the region's intelligentsia, and important socio-cultural groups, which have played major roles in Igbo thought leadership and ascendancy in the past. So rather than bemoan under the weight of despondency that is pervasive in Southeast today, the region must see its current political dilemma as a great opportunity for introspection and mobilization for the resurgence of Igbo leadership that will frame the challenges before us within Buhari's Nigeria and canvass strategic engagement options for survival under the prevailing circumstances. Igbo Renaissance will require a pan-Igbo effort involving the participation of all segments of our population. Political office does not necessarily confer wisdom, and I hold strongly that co-opting the region's intelligentsia and socio-cultural groups, including faith institutions, to generate ideas, as well as act as sounding boards for public policy options, will have positive outcomes. What the Yoruba elite was able to demonstrate is that leadership is not always necessary to exercise at an individual level. The key to Yoruba success has been the triumph of collective leadership, whereby individual members of the elite were able to, or motivated by their visions of enlightened collective self-interest, to subsume personal ambition or temptation for instant gratification to a much bigger price for their region. With patience and wisdom could be brought to their predicament. It is probably common knowledge to someone that in addition to all of these things, even whilst they were in the trenches, the Yoruba elite proceeded to actually formalize a development structure called the Development Agency Agenda for Western Nigeria, the Dawn Commission, where they actually came together and have built consensus on the development aspirations and the strategies for really taking the Southwest forward. If we must achieve this Igbo Renaissance, it will be critical that we leverage our history as builders and as innovators. So I'd like to proceed by saying that there can be an Igbo Renaissance. In order for this to happen, however, we must embark on a journey of cultural rediscovery and leverage our history as builders and innovators. We must return to first principles to interrogate and discover our identity. Who are we? What are we known for? What factors have converged to erode our identity and cultural values in the way that they have become eroded today? How and why have we come from the positions of leadership and preeminence in academia, in science, in medicine, in history, politics, that our forebears earned and merit to the positions of underdogs? Despised, humiliated, we're literally begging for our lives. Literally, we seem apologetic about everything. But ladies and gentlemen, Igbos are courageous people. Igbos are warriors. Igbos are resilient. Above all, the Igbo are a people steeped in their veneration of justice. We believe that actions have consequences and that leadership focuses on the leader the obligation to rule, guide, and influence the people justly, courageously, and with visible results in improvement of the well-being of all society. Our history is replete with acts of heroism by our forebears as they fought for their dignity at various times. And those familiar with Enugu will know that the sculptured work of men breaking free from chains mounted at the Rangers Avenue roundabout en route to Government House Enugu is a memorial of sorts for coal miners massacred by colonialists at River Valley coal mines in 1949 by protesting poor working conditions. You may have read about the Aba Women Rebellion in 1929 over the introduction of taxes for women, but you may not have heard about the scope and impact of that resistance across the length and breadth of the then Eastern region, which covered the current Southeast and South-South geopolitical zones. I urge you all to take more interest in history, especially Igbo history. I find it really fascinating. There are also copious historical accounts of the heroic acts undertaken by Igbo slaves to die in dignity, to such as the 1773 mass suicide aboard the slave ship New Britannia. You may already know about the exploits of Lord of the Vine, an Igbo slave who became the first slave by his freedom. He subsequently campaigned for the abolition of slavery. Kalu Wauma social mobility from slave to slaver, warrant chief, Presbyterian elder, and British knight between 1865 and 1940 is also worthy of note. Igbos are innovators and builders, and our fathers before us, their heirs and successors, continue to record many firsts in multiple fields of heaven. And I'm happy to share with you the history of people like Kenneth Dike, the first black vice chancellor of the University of Ibadan, people like Professor Chikobi, first Nigerian professor of mathematics, people like Professor Frank Ndidi, PhD in nuclear physics and chemistry, Dr. Philip Emegbali, computer scientist, Dr. Pius Oke, first Nigerian PhD in economics, Professor Chinua Achebe, author of Things Fall Apart, Steve Predekwensi, Chimamanda Adichie, Ada Priscillians Bureau, the first female doctor in 1950, Simon Momo, the second woman doctor, Ben Emo, foremost artist, and the first black person to have the Queen of England sit for into sculpture, for into sculpture. I can go on and on, there's so many of them. Professor Francesca Okeke, University of Nigeria, scientific study on climate change. Damien Ayam, radio transmitters from Harvard Granules and local materials. Philip Animalu, PhD in physics, theory of high temperature superconductivity. Professor Platinum, Professor of robotics. Dr. Chimaru Kinnaman, Peter Surgeon. These are Igbo sons and daughters. This list is not exhaustive. We've not even scratched the surface. But the point I'm trying to make is that our people have the intent. Our people have the exposure. Our people have the capacity. And this is not a capacity that was earned today. It's the capacity that is almost in our DNA. It's been there, it's been demonstrated in the course of our history. Now, having said all of this, I want to ask the question, do Igbo really need government? So I've listed for you everything that has happened from 1999 to 2019. The positions that were held. And I'm asking, what's the legacy of those positions? I need you to answer that. And so, but it makes me answer, do Igbo really need government? So in the early part of my presentation tonight, I draw attention to the presentation that Igbo have had in government in the last 20 years since Nigeria's return to democracy. I've similarly shared with you. I'm going to share with you very briefly an abridged account of the Okpara years, Michael Okpara years, 1959 to 1966. I must confess that even as I realized that the two periods constitute two different historical epochs, I'm unable to resist the temptation to compare both of those, especially in terms of the benefits that accrue to the region from government, the former being regional and the latter subnational, states, and national and federal. Now, the stark contrast in achievement and impact of government on the Igbo nation during the two periods underscores the importance of quality leadership at every level of public governance and government actions and resources. The Igbo Renaissance will therefore be sustained through the agency of visionary and disciplined political leadership across the current 5 states of the Union. 5 southwest states. Now, political leadership is critical. But the primacy of the private sector is even more so, especially in a market-driven economy like Nigeria's, for an Igbo Renaissance to be realized and sustained. And my position is rooted in the acephalous nature of Igbo society, and its amenability to only subtle political control. The Igbo take their destinies in their hands rather than wait for help from other bodies. Unafraid to chart new courses, the Igbo are adventurous and explore new territories. Widely traveled, and Igbo are probably the most widely traveled of Nigeria's ethnic groups, willing to go anywhere just to make a living. It is therefore no wonder that Igbo investment across the country is reported to be higher than the GDP or the Nigerian economy. The size of Nigeria's GDP is about $500 billion. And Igbo investments across the states of Nigeria is reported to be in excess of 900 trillion naira. That's in excess of $2 trillion. A study by the International Journal of Science Study Research A study by the International Journal of Science and Technical Research highlighted the attributes of Igbo as communal, as capitalist, as republican, and individualistic, with strong attachment to family. The same study suggested or reported that Igbos own 74% of investments in Lagos. This, to my mind, shows clearly that the salvation for Igbos will not come from government, but from its people, especially its entrepreneurial class. I'd like to point out that given the increasingly volatile political environment in Nigeria and the penchant to attack Igbo and their businesses, Igbo businesses must articulate or adopt a risk mitigation strategy to protect their business interests scattered all over Nigeria. I don't know how many of you have seen the threats issued yesterday by a northern group, giving governors who were opposed to the Ruga settlement policy of government 30 days to change their minds, otherwise they will send back every southerner and other parts of the country. I have highlighted some of our history very briefly, but nothing underscores the glorious past and the latent capacity of the Igbo as builders and innovators as much as the quality of leadership that catalyzed the transformative economic growth which made the economy in the Eastern region the fastest growing economy in the world, according to a study by the Michigan State University at the time. And again, for the benefit of the young members of this audience in particular, I want to ask the question, who was Michael Okpara? And Michael Okpara was Premier of the Eastern region. He was born in 1920 and passed on in 1984. He was Premier of the Eastern region from 1959 to 1966 under the party called the NCNC, the National Council of Nigerian Cameroons. Based on recent historical accounts, Dr. Michael Okpara remains one of the most outstanding Igbo leaders of the 20th century. And in a lecture delivered in Abuja on February 26, 2014, excerpts of which I have taken verbatim below, Prof. Anya Oanya described the period of Okpara's stewardship of Eastern Nigeria as the golden age in Nigeria's development. According to him, by 1964, 5 years after Okpara's ascendancy to the premiership, Eastern Nigeria, as reported by the research group in Michigan State University in the USA, was the fastest growing and industrializing economy in the world, ahead of Malaysia, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. How did this happen? It was the combination of Okpara's unique vision, in which agriculture and industrial development were the twin pillars on which he built the Eastern Nigerian economy. In agriculture, his plans had a twofold thrust: the development of the farm settlements and the anchor for food crops, such as rice, and poultry development, as well as the establishment of estates of palm oil, cocoa, cashew, which were processed for export. Alongside the agricultural projects were the numerous industrial projects scattered over the length and breadth of Nigeria. And ladies and gentlemen, please take particular note of what I'm about to say. Next. In one frenetic burst of energy, a wave of maniacal and friendly activity was going on over Eastern Nigeria. As the book of Dr. Okpara reminds us, by January 25, 1963, the Michelin factory at Port Harcourt was opened. The tire factory was a US $3 million undertaking. On March 22 of the same year, the headquarters building of the Universal Insurance Company was opened in Enugu. On May 10, the Nigerian gas factory was commissioned at MNN Enugu. On May 16, the aluminium factory at Port Harcourt was opened. On August 14, the glass factory became operative in Port Harcourt. On October 18, the asbestos cement factory was opened in MNN. On November 9, the foundation of the Central Bank was laid in Port Harcourt. On November 30, the Golden Guinea Breweries was commissioned at Umuahia for the production of lager beer and allied products. On December 13, Hotel Presidential was opened at a whopping cost of 2 million British pounds. So the burning fire for industrialization led to the establishment of the modern ceramic industry in Umuahia, textile mills at Aba and Onitsha, and a shoe factory in Owerri. there was a catalogue of numerous small industries that were also established simultaneously with the major ones during this time. So during this period that the first phase of the farm settlement scheme were established in Uloana, in Umuahia province, or Haji in Owerri province, Mariam in Onitsha, Boki in Ogoja, Usuwan in Enugu province, Aba in Anambra province. Each was to accommodate about 5,000 farmers. And what was remarkable was scrupulous effort to ensure even spread of these settlements throughout the land and breadth of the region. All these activities have been elaborated in his vision for the development of the region after general elections in 1961. I'm going to skip some of these out, but I need to point out the very strong engagement we have in the private sector. As he observed, to achieve rapid economic growth and raise the standard of living of the people, it was necessary that private citizens, the ordinary men and women everywhere, must participate by taking a fair and equitable share in our development and industrial programs. But more importantly, they acknowledged government's fiduciary responsibility, and it was an incredible display of courage in the midst of rapid economic platforms. The remarkable aspect of the presidential plan was the collaboration and cooperation with foreign investors to undertake the large industries such as the International Factory in Port Harcourt and the Dallas Cement Factory in Bedford. Indeed, Omara's plan, his vision, was that the entire corridor coming from Port Harcourt through Aba to Okigwe to Enugu onwards to Nsukka was going to be a megapolis, a major industrial city. All these things were clearly articulated in the plan that they had at the time. It was also during the same time that the University of Nigeria was conceived and executed. All of these things were done under the auspices of the Eastern Nigerian Development Commission, ENDC. The more incredible for me was that he brought in the House of Arrogance. And so, we see that the days there on the party is both friends for the LC and the civil service allowed what to deal with it. The intelligentsia, the left to Professor Carlo Ezera, and the economic domain to Sir Louis Nursi. These were his aging cabinet, as it were, and beyond the cornerstone of the party and the bureaucracy. Our success rested on his understanding of his people and the operating environment that shaped him and his people. In conclusion, I want to say that Dr. Opara's achievements were not happenstance. The quality and the flawless execution of his plan suggested that he came to government with a purpose. His personality, his overall comportment and achievement suggest a deep consciousness about his reason for being. Michael Opara's success exemplifies for us what good leadership should be and how it is delivered. He had a clear vision which matched the task at hand. He organized to get the right people and empowered them to join the effort. And he employed his organizational skills to ensure that the actions of his government and the people working with him were consistent with the visions. Now, I hadn't read much about his time in government when I made the following submission during the 2014 National Conference in Abuja. Nigeria cannot develop by accident. No nation has and can develop by accident. The old and the new civilizations that we aspire to be like were not built by accident. They were not built by mediocres. Kleptomaniacs did not build them. Ethnic and religious identities did not build them. Visionaries who were disciplined built them. They were built through a conscious and dedicated effort, anchored in deep commitment to the welfare and well-being of their people and their place in the world. These nations have continued to make progress for the same considerations today. I'd therefore like to, from this podium, challenge all the leaders of our people, that what we need and what we must demand and what all of us must work for is another Michael Opara moment. We need the rebirth of vision and courage, determination and industry, ambition and success to create an Aladdin man. What of the potentials that Almighty has so generously endowed in our people. Thank you.